Welcome to this special broadcast of All Hands Television. After more than 30 years of bringing news, stories, and information to the fleet, this is our final edition. December 7th marks the 70th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and we couldn't think of a more appropriate way to close out our show than to come here and look back at that fateful day. 21 ships were sunk or damaged during the attack, and America lost more than 2,300 military personnel and civilians. We begin our program at the Arizona Memorial with a story about the sailors who support this sacred place.
My name is Seaman Anna Wagner, and I drive the boats for the USS Arizona Memorial. A lot of people are surprised too when they find out that I'm just a seaman. A lot of people think I'm an officer, like, oh, must be a captain, but when they find out I'm just a seaman, and a lot of the retired Navy are always really surprised and what, a seaman's driving the boat? So it's kind of funny. I'm from a small town, so it's in Idaho, so it's definitely lots of different people and all different cultures. And in the beginning, being in front of so many people was a little nerve-wracking, but once I got used to it, standing in front of 150 people, giving my speech, wasn't so bad after that. So, but there's definitely days where you just get picture after picture, and so I'm probably in a million pictures, I don't even know. We do about 4 trips an hour when we're busy. We're on 15s, and then sometimes it'll get slower throughout the day, and then we'll do 2 an hour. So, well, 150 on every boat. We have probably about like 4,000 around that, like every day. So probably more. Yeah, it's a lot. I've learned a lot of history since I've been here, but a lot of people ask me questions too, and I get stumped every day because they come up with some new ones. But I definitely do feel like a living piece of history for the boat drivers, because I get to hear a lot of the stories from the survivors that most people won't get to hear. So firsthand experiences that a lot of people don't even know about. So.
If you're interested in this amazing duty, contact your detailer. Service members standing guard over America in the 1940s were faced with many uncertainties. The United States was beginning to rebuild after the Great Depression, and Europe was in turmoil. The country watched the conflicts overseas, wondering if or when the U.S. would get involved.
The attack on Pearl Harbor was part of a surprise airborne assault by the Japanese Navy against American military targets around the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on the morning of Sunday, December 7th, 1941. Immediately, this surprise attack brought the United States into the Second World War. In Europe, Germany recovered from her defeat in World War I. Adolf Hitler and his followers rebuilt Germany's economy and military. Their dream was to restore Germany by conquering all of Europe. In 1939, Hitler fired the opening shots of World War II by invading Poland. England and France responded to the invasion by declaring war against Germany. The United States remained sympathetic and supportive of her European friends, but neutral. By the summer of 1940, Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France had fallen. Hitler put a torch to English cities every night with a blitz of bombing raids. During the day, German and British pilots dueled in the skies above England. With victory on all fronts, Hitler found common cause with the nation of Japan. Both countries believed they required and deserved more space for their people and cultures to expand, one in Europe, the other across Asia. Along with Italy, the 3 countries drafted a pact, agreeing that every nation in the world shall receive the space to which it is entitled. In September of 1940, the Axis powers was born. The collapse of France in the summer of 1940 took away Europe's first line of defense against Japan's expansion in Asia. French Indochina became exposed and vulnerable. Japan moved to occupy its northern half, completing her quick conquest in September without firing a shot. With its newly enlarged presence in the Pacific, Japan began shutting down supply routes to China. In retaliation, the American Congress demanded that President Franklin D. Roosevelt issue a trade embargo against Japan. The Panama Canal was closed to her shipping. Japanese assets in the United States were frozen. Japan was derived of copper, brass, high-grade metal scrap, and most importantly, oil. This forced Japan to search hungrily, again around the Pacific, to replenish her dwindling supplies. Again, events on the opposite side of the globe sped Japan's march towards war with the United States. On July 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. This freed Japan to look south again, to complete the occupation of Southeast Asia. Within days, Japanese troops took control of the rest of French Indochina. The next day, the United States, followed quickly by Britain and the Netherlands, imposed a total trade embargo on Japan. From this moment on for Japan, conflict with the Western Allies became a certainty. Quietly, the Japanese government made the official decision to go to war with America rather than surrender its gains in China and Indochina. For the next 5 months, efforts were made on both sides to avoid the coming crisis, but these were often half-hearted diplomatic smokescreens, serving each side as a way to gain more time to prepare. For America and Japan, the days to back away from war grew fewer and darker.
Tensions between America and Japan were rising, all while the U.S. was still recovering from the Great Depression. It was a difficult time in the country. When we come back, we'll look at the events that led up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. But first, Master Chief Petty Officer of the Navy Rick West has a message for the fleet.
As we commemorate the 70th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, I would like to say thank you to all those who have gone before us and laid the foundation that we build upon today. Shipmates, time is fleeting. If you get a chance to shake a World War II veteran's hand, do so, and thank them for their service. Every day, more than 1,000 World War II veterans from our greatest generation pass away. Make time count and recognize their heroic efforts.
Welcome back. The early 1940s were full of conflicts and bloodshed as World War II was heating up. Japan was trying to enlarge their empire, and the United States was standing in the way. Let's take a look at how a U.S. trade embargo against Japan slowed their expansion plans.
The devastating air raid on Pearl Harbor in the early hours of December 7, 1941, came as a surprise, but not a complete surprise. For years, Japan viewed war with the West as inevitable. She needed room to expand. Looking out across the Pacific, Japan saw the colonies of Europe and the United States. Despite threats from the Western powers, Japan decided she needed colonies too. Japanese expansion began against the weaker nations of Southeast Asia, Korea, China, Indochina, with designs on Burma and Singapore. This left only the United States standing in Japan's way. America, still reeling from the Great Depression of the 1930s, focused on restoring its economy at the expense of its armed forces. The Japanese military knew it couldn't win a long, drawn-out war with America. If they were going to fight, they would have to hit hard, fast, and first. Japan faced a now or never dilemma. They chose now. The Japanese adopted a two-pronged approach. They prepared for war before the end of the year, while continuing diplomatic efforts for peace. The U.S. Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, insisted Japan not only remove all troops immediately from China and Indochina, but that she withdraw from the Tripartite Act. The Japanese government refused, feeling these demands were too harsh. Cordell Hull stood his ground. Meanwhile, secret preparations for an attack on Pearl Harbor continued. Two-man crews trained in midget submarines would be used against targets on Battleship Row, and Japanese spies on Oahu reported on the movements of the American fleet, harbor security, and conditions at the naval and army airfields around the island. To achieve surprise, a daring plan was developed. The Japanese knew that the American patrol aircraft out of Hawaii, Wake and Midway, flew patrols within a 500-mile radius. The planes did not patrol to the north, above the 40th parallel. No Japanese naval ship in the 10 years had crossed the Pacific in December north of this latitude. The winter conditions made such a crossing too perilous and refueling too difficult. Any attack by the Japanese was expected to come from the south, so in Tokyo, the decision was taken. The hazardous 40th parallel would be the approach to Pearl Harbor. In Washington, a coded telegram was sent to all U.S. military commands in the Pacific. The peace talks with the Japanese were not going well. All installations were alerted to be on the lookout for Japanese moves against the Philippines, the Thai or KRA peninsulas, or Borneo. The warning specified that if hostilities cannot, repeat, cannot, be avoided, the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. The messages did not mention Pearl Harbor. In Washington, peace negotiations continued, but in name only. Japanese diplomats in America had not been told of the Armada, steaming east 3,300 miles across an icy Pacific. Instructions were sent to Japanese ambassadors in Italy and Germany to inform Mussolini and Hitler that war may come quicker than anyone dreams. These messages were intercepted by American codebreakers. Still, no one in the U.S. knew of or even imagined the war fleet bearing down on Pearl Harbor. On December 4th, the Japanese government decided to issue a formal declaration of war against the United States. On December 5th, a message was intercepted by the U.S. codebreakers instructing the Japanese envoys to burn papers and destroy code machines. American intelligence knew an enemy attack was imminent, but where? U.S. military commands throughout the Pacific were on guard. At Pearl Harbor, vigilance was increased against sabotage or submarine attacks, but no other routines were changed. Air patrols took off as scheduled. Anti-aircraft batteries were lightly manned. The sailors aboard ships in the harbor, soldiers in their barracks, settled in for a pleasant Hawaiian winter weekend. Early on December 7th, a cable arrived at the Japanese embassy in Washington. This was the formal declaration of war. 200 miles north of Hawaii, the Kido Butai reached its launch point. At first light, pilots strapped themselves into their cockpits. Large ocean swells rocked the carriers. The deck swayed up to 15 degrees. These conditions would have canceled any exercise, but this was no drill. On the Akagi, the signal was given. The first Zero zoomed forward, off the deck, dipped to 15 feet above the ocean, then banked left and climbed. Following him was the first wave of the air assault, 183 fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes. In the pre-dawn gray and rocking seas, only one fighter crashed. The rest circled above the Pacific towards a sleeping and unsuspecting Pearl Harbor.
Japan planned to strike America within 30 minutes of declaring war. America suspected an attack was coming, but had no idea where or when. When we come back, we'll learn how Japan kept the attack a surprise. Our last segment ended with diplomats at the Japanese embassy translating a declaration of war for delivery to the U.S. American military bases were on guard. They just didn't know where an attack would happen.
Nimitz looked at the bright side. He says the Japanese just blew it. They didn't get our oil and they didn't get our yards.
70 years ago, Japan was preparing to declare war on the United States. Training for the attack started in the spring of 1941 under the command of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Nagumo's fleet included all 6 carriers in the Japanese Navy, 24 other vessels, and a separate group of submarines to sink American warships that escaped the carrier strike force. Sunday morning in Honolulu was for sleeping in, making pancakes, and going to church. People living on the island of Oahu paid little attention to the hum of planes in the distance, believing they were part of an Army or Navy drill. 130 vessels of the U.S. Pacific Fleet were parked at their moorings, except the Pacific Fleet's 3 aircraft carriers. The Japanese strike force took up position 230 miles north of Oahu. Early December 7th, there were men at their posts on base manning the watch. At 6:40 a.m., the destroyer USS Ward identified the conning tower of a Japanese submarine off the coast of Pearl Harbor. The Ward attacked and sunk the submarine. They reported the sinking as a routine event. Also, before 7 a.m., the Opana Point radar station detected a large flight of aircraft approaching the island from the north. They thought the aircraft were a flight of B-17s coming from the mainland. The first wave of the Japanese carrier strike force had 183 aircraft. They attacked shortly before 8 a.m., hitting the base airfields and the fleet anchored in Pearl Harbor. The leader of the first attack wave sent coded messages back to Admiral Nagumo that the attack had begun. When there was not a single U.S. Army or Navy plane responding, he radioed Tora, 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 meaning tiger, tiger, tiger. These code words meant the surprise had been achieved. Army Air Corps airplanes, parked wing to wing as defense against possible sabotage, were parked at the airfields of Hickam, Wheeler, and Bellows. Naval aircraft were lined up at Ford Island and Kaneohe Bay Naval Air Stations. Marine aircraft were parked at Ava Marine Corps Air Station. The airfields were hit hard, destroying the aircraft before they could rise to intercept the Japanese. Hundreds of planes were destroyed on the ground, and hundreds of men were killed or wounded. The primary targets were the more than 100 ships anchored in Pearl Harbor, including the 8 battleships. USS Nevada, with their commander ashore, flooding below decks, and against incredible odds, got underway and headed to the channel to cheers from witnesses. The ship survived 3 bomb hits and kept moving, but the possibility of blocking the channel forced her courageous crew to beach the ship.
I was on the West Virginia, which was a battleship, and it was the first ship that was sunk at Pearl. Many of the battleships were in the harbor, and half of them got sunk and half of them didn't, but I was on the first one down.
USS West Virginia took 6 aerial torpedoes and then sunk into Pearl Harbor. USS Oklahoma, hit by 9 torpedoes, capsized in less than 12 minutes.
Couldn't see a thing. It was black, 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 dark, dark. And so I just tried to, there were bodies floating all around me. And then I saw a light.
Hundreds of men were trapped below decks. Some were trapped for more than 25 hours and rescued. 429 lost their lives.
We were down about 50 feet deep in the depths of Pearl Harbor. I swam and swam and swam, and finally got to the surface, and there was burning fuel oil all around me.
At about 8:10 a.m., an armor-piercing bomb hit USS Arizona's forward ammunition magazine. The explosion and fire instantly killed over 1,000 crewmen. The repair ship USS Vestal was moored to Arizona. The explosion and fireball burst 500 feet in the air, blew men off nearby ships, and snuffed out the flames on the Vestal, saving the repair ship. A second wave of 170 Japanese planes arrived at 8:40 a.m. and was met with gunfire. The strike force continued to pound the airfields, Battleship Row, and the shipyards. At 10 a.m., the attack was over. Admiral Nagumo did consider a third attack, but knowing the absent U.S. carriers could pose a threat, he ordered the force home. The Admiral felt the 2 waves of attack had neutralized the Pacific Fleet, which was the objective. 21 vessels, including all 8 battleships, were sunk or damaged. 170 aircraft were destroyed, and 150 were damaged. American loss of life totaled 2,390 military personnel and civilians. 1,177 men, nearly half the fatalities, died on USS Arizona. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and 65 men were killed.
Surprisingly, a lot of people don't realize that we only lost 2 battleships. We lost Oklahoma and Arizona.
Within weeks, 3 battleships were returned to service. Eventually, all but 3 of the ships sunk or damaged were completely repaired and returned to duty. The attack united a nation behind a complete commitment to victory in World War II. 44 months of war followed the attack on Pearl Harbor, and sea power determined the course of the struggle. There was a decisive shift in naval warfare, from the battleship to the dominance of carrier-based aircraft in the submarine. Japanese naval forces spearheaded their conquest of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, where they were blunted by U.S. Navy ships and aircraft in the battles of Coral Sea and Midway. This led the way to U.S. victories on Japanese-occupied islands, and ultimately to U.S. victory in the Pacific on August 15, 1945. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, America grew into a world superpower with the responsibility to safeguard freedom and to answer the call when and where threatened. Our nation is grateful and indebted to those who gave their lives on December 7, 1941. We remain steadfast to the cry, "Remember Pearl Harbor," with a strong Navy that provides security, stability, and sea power for our people and around the globe.
America will never forget the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's one of the reasons that to this day, our Navy continues to train and prepare for any scenario. We remember and honor our military heroes with special ceremonies and burials at sea. Many survivors of the attack want their ashes buried here at Pearl Harbor.
Today we are honoring an American hero. And now the United States Navy will honor him by scattering his ashes in the waters of Pearl Harbor, as he so richly deserves.
2, 8, 5.
My name is Master Chief James Taylor, United States Navy, retired. I'm best known for being the individual who coordinates the services for the scattering of ashes and interments here in Pearl Harbor.
As years went by, I became more and more involved with the Pearl Harbor survivors themselves and all of their burials, and I've been the only one that's done any of them, I'd say, for the last 10 years.
I have been privileged to meet hundreds of Pearl Harbor survivors at the various ceremonies that are here, and also the ones that live here locally, and I just enjoy being with them.
That's the first round I fired December the 7th.
To me, they're heroes. To me, anybody and everybody that served in a military uniform are heroes. Well, we all know that World War II started here, and it has history that'll never be told. Every day I learn something new. Pearl Harbor was the home port, and still is, of the finest Navy in the world. I think that the reason that they want their ashes scattered in the harbor, in Pearl Harbor in particular, is because their shipmates, their brothers in arms, were killed that day. The ocean does draw people, and it's like family. I want to be with family when they go. So this year's 70th is vitally important, not only to the survivors, but also to their families. So the families are the ones that really should attend that ceremony also, so they can carry on the legacy of their loved ones who served.
It is a big deal, and unfortunately, it's going to be the last visit for an awful lot of Pearl Harbor survivors that are coming for the event. Most of them now are unable to travel because of their physical condition, and it's going to be kind of a sad event for me, simply because I won't see these guys again alive. I'll see them when their families bring them here, but I'll make it through it, and I do know that when I'm hoping and I'm praying that I can stay healthy enough to keep on doing this until they're all gone.
How fitting for our Pearl Harbor veterans to be buried with their shipmates. Thanks to these dedicated volunteers, veterans can be sure their burial wishes are honored. The Arizona Memorial may be the most prominent landmark in Pearl Harbor, but there are several other historical markers. Here's a look at some of the other memorials on the island.
Several memorials were established in Pearl Harbor to remember the Japanese airstrike on U.S. naval forces on December 7, 1941. These memorials now draw in several million people from the U.S. and other nations each year. The most well-known of these attractions is the USS Arizona Memorial. Visited by more than 1 million people annually, the memorial is accessible only by boat. The memorial itself crosses above the middle of the sunken hull of the ship without touching it. Oil from the Arizona still rises from the wreckage. The oil is referred to as the Tears of the Arizona. Arizona was declared a National Historic Landmark May 1989. Another memorial is the still submerged wreck of USS Utah. The capsized wreck was only partially righted to clear an adjacent berth in 1944. It was dedicated as a memorial in 1972 and declared a National Historic Landmark in 1989. Although the ship is no longer at Pearl Harbor, the legacy of USS Oklahoma lives on in a memorial dedicated in December 2007. The black granite wall suggests the hull of the Oklahoma, while the aligned marble represents the crew manning the rails. USS Missouri was the last U.S. battleship launched and the last to be decommissioned. The Mighty Mo served as the platform where Japan signed its unconditional surrender to Allied forces on September 2, 1945, ending the Second World War. After its final decommissioning in 1992, Missouri was eventually transferred to Ford Island in Pearl Harbor. It opened as a museum January 29, 1998.
If you get a chance to come to Pearl Harbor, be sure to visit our memorials and honor those who paid the ultimate sacrifice. Thank you for joining us for this special program. We'd like to send a heartfelt thank you to all the service members, civilians, and all those who helped to produce All Hands Television. This program, which has had several different names, could not have happened without their support. We will continue to produce video products about our Navy. You can find these new products online at Navy.mil or at many social media networks, so please be sure to check them out. For the All Hands Television team, I'm Petty Officer James Stillipek. Thank you for watching.